All right, guys, well, welcome to episode 6 of the League Express podcast now. We did 2 episodes last week, and this one will make 6. My name's Jake KEARNAN, and joining me as always is the editor of League Express, MARTYN SADLER.
Yeah, we're getting used to it now, Jake, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right.
It's
starting to become muscle memory, which is nice.
Yes.
But what a weekend of football, Martin. Obviously, there was a few surprise results. We might get into the 2 televised games to start with.
It was interesting on both sides of the world at the weekend, Jake, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Everywhere rugby league is played, it was interesting stuff.
Oh, that's right. Well, with the NRL, obviously, they're coming towards the end of their season, and as a Broncos fan, I'm sitting on the edge of my seat every week hoping that we don't have any injuries. But yeah, I guess we'll dive into, let's go the Hull KR defeat of Leigh Leopards, 52-10. Did you see this one coming, Martin? I definitely didn't expect it.
Not to that extent. I did tip Hull KR to win, but certainly not by 52 points to 10. But I think it's interesting, isn't it, that Leigh won the Challenge Cup on a tidal wave of euphoria. It was a fantastic win for them, and they were so happy, and everybody at the club celebrated as they should have done. I mean, it was just such an amazing result and an amazing performance. The following week, they played Catalans at home, and they were winning at half-time, but then the game ran away with them in the second half, and they went down to defeat. And in a sense, I think the Hull KR game was probably the real reaction to the Challenge Cup final win. It is true that every Challenge Cup final winning team seems to go through a bit of a trough of some sort after they've won the Challenge Cup. And it takes different teams different amounts of time to recover from that. You know, in Hull in 2005 went completely to the dogs. Leeds in 2014 had a similar experience where their season collapsed after winning the Challenge Cup. I think with Leigh, I think the good thing about Friday night's result from Leigh's point of view is that hopefully it gets that reaction out of their system. And this weekend they play Huddersfield, of course, at home. And with any luck, by the time they take to the field at the weekend, they will have forgotten about the Challenge Cup in terms of, you know, in terms of the celebration of that success, and they'll be refocused again on getting into the playoffs, which they're certain to do, but making a bid to get to Old Trafford. And, you know, that's going to be what it's all about from now on. The Challenge Cup is a fantastic thing to have done, but it's now history, isn't it? And Leigh need to recognise that. Everybody in the club needs to recognise it. I'm sure Adrian Lamb does already, but he just seems to get that message across to all his players, and I think they'll be the better for it once they've done that.
I think over the past 2 weeks they've had, you know, a fair few rest days with their training regimes. You'd expect that this week, you know, they'd be back to, you know, a full training schedule and, you know, trying to put the last 2 weeks behind them. You
would imagine so, although it won't be an easy time for them this weekend, because Huddersfield are 4 points outside the 6. They've got a very slim chance of making the 6. They could still do it, but if they're going to, they've got to win this weekend. So there's no relaxing for Leigh. And if we go back to last Friday night's game, I think Hull Kingston Rovers were absolutely magnificent in front of their own supporters. You know, they came out like an express train, and, you know, some of their guys just, I thought, played exceptionally well. Ryan Hall, I mean, he's an amazing guy, isn't he? 35 years old, looks as though he could go on playing forever. He had another great game, I thought. Mikey Lewis moved into the halves and again, you know, had a great game for Hull KR. I never, excuse me, I can't quite understand which is his best position, whether it's fullback or at halfback, but. You know, what a great young kid. So much enthusiasm. I love to see players who play with enthusiasm. And Mikey Lewis is very near the top of that list, I've got to say.
Absolutely. And I thought Sean Kinney-Dowell,
yes.
He just ages like a fine wine, doesn't he?
I mean, for him to be retiring at the end of this season, you know, he's definitely going to do it. There's no changing his mind, it seems. But, you know, you do get the feeling that he certainly could go on another year at least. And but what a great way to go out it would be if they could actually win a trophy and get to Old Trafford and actually win the competition. Because I think he's been a real great... When we look at the history of overseas recruits in Super League, I think he will be in the top 10 and probably the top 5. of overseas recruits who we've seen since 1996, since Super League began. I rate him that highly. So we'll see how the rest of the season unfolds, of course.
Yeah, definitely. Moving on, we also had another surprise result. Wigan 34 defeated Catalans 0. Did you see this coming?
I'd love to say yes, of course I did, but of course I didn't. I thought Catalans would win that game, playing at home in front of a sellout crowd. It was a massive event for them, and they'd beaten Wigan to 0 twice already this season. That's the amazing thing, the 42-0 and 28-0. So I thought the odds were stacked against Wigan, but Wigan just came out and blasted them. And again, it was just one of those games where nothing much seemed to go right for Catalans, and they're now only 2 points ahead in Super League. They could be caught in terms of the League Leaders' Shield at the end of the season. And Wigan have got this habit, Jake. Obviously, you're an Australian. You probably don't know as much about British Rugby League perhaps as I might, but Wigan have got this incredible habit of growing stronger as we get to the business end of the season. And we can see that, can't we, with this performance at the weekend. They're just peaking at the right time. It's a bit like a racehorse, in the Derby that times its run in the final furlong to win the race at the post. It's that sort of thing. And Wigan have always had this ability. They're very rarely flunked out at playoff time, and I can see them getting to Old Trafford again this year. I think they're very firm favourites to do so.
Yeah, and obviously on the other side of the ball, Catalans, sometimes it's good for a contending team heading into playoffs to have that one or two losses just to try and reset and refocus on the end goal. Do you think this loss will benefit them going forward?
Well, I'm never quite sure how a loss can benefit a club, but especially when it's of that size, 34-0. But having said that, they've got to recuperate quickly and get back on the horse and get back to winning ways. And the interesting thing is this coming weekend, they're actually at Hull Kingston Rovers, aren't they, on Friday night? So that's going to be a fascinating game because if Hull KR won by 42 points and Catalans lost by 34 points, so you might think on that basis that that the Catalans are going to struggle at Hull KR. I suspect it will be a much closer game than we saw for either team at the weekend. But I still think Hull KR could win it, and they need to, of course, because at the moment they're in 7th place in the table, equal on points with Warrington and Salford, but and they've got the same points difference at Salford, but just a slightly worse scoring average than Salford, and that's why they're 7th and not 6th. So Hull KR need to keep winning if they're going to be a top 6 team, and this Friday's game is going to be a massive one for them.
And what the hell was going on with that pitch the other day? With the fungal infection, I think it was.
It did look awful, didn't it? Now, I don't know whether that might have affected their players in some way psychologically. Who knows? But I'm not quite sure what the problem is with that pitch. I've not checked it out since seeing it, I've got to say, Jake. But certainly somebody's done something to it that hasn't worked all that well.
Yeah, I think I read that they borrowed a lawnmower from the Rugby Union Club, and then that spread some sort of infection and caused all those bizarre
Was it
sessions.
a subtle plot from by the Rugby Union Club?
It might have been.
Probably not. I can't really imagine that.
Maybe Wigan's paid them off, maybe to cause some dramas.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's great. Moving on, so we had St Helens 34 defeated Castleford 4. A pretty strong performance from St Helens.
Yes, and that was a bit easier to see coming, especially when you saw the players who didn't play for Castleford. They had quite a weakened side compared to the side that had travelled to Wakefield a week earlier and got that great win there. So St Helens, again, like Wigan, they're both those sides just have this remarkable ability to tool up at the right time of the season, and Saints are doing it. It's not difficult to imagine a Wigan Saints grand final, is it really? Despite the fact that many of us would like to see some new teams in the grand final, I can really easily see those two sides getting there, and Saints were just far too strong for Castlewood on Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. And Salford 20 defeated Wakefield Trinity 0. Another probably not so surprising this one either.
Yes, I mean I obviously didn't see that game, but it was supposed to be a fairly poor game, really, according to most reports. But Salford, as they always do, scored some great tries. Ryan Brearley, 2 tries, brilliant support play from fullback. I really like Ryan at fullback. And the thing about Salford now, of course, is that they do have their first choice spine back in action. And those 4 players, Brierley, Croft, Sneed and Ackers, playing together are going to be a threat to anybody. So it's going to be very interesting for them. And of course they're battling to stay in the top the top 6. And on Friday night they travel to Wigan. So that's a massive test for them. And by the time this weekend is over, they may or may not still be in the top 6. We're not sure about that, of course.
Absolutely. We also had Warrington 18 defeat Hull FC 4. A good win for Warrington and a much needed one.
Well, if ever a team needed to win, it was Warrington. 8 defeats in a row coming into this game, which was they'd won 8 in a row at the start of the season. Hull suffered a massive blow with the loss of Jake Truman to an Achilles tendon injury. I've not seen the latest update on that injury, but it's almost certain to put him out for the rest of the season. And I feel so sorry for the kid because, he's a former Albert Goldthorpe Rookie of the Year that we presented a few years ago. And he's an immensely talented young man, but has suffered really badly with injury. And this is just the latest one to strike him down, and it's very sad. But Warrington, the great thing about Warrington was, I thought, 2 of their key players were back to top form. One, of course, was George Williams. The other was Matt Duffy at full back, who I thought, sliced through the Hull defence several times, scored a try, a brilliant try, actually, if you've seen it. Potential try of the week, of course. And if they can start playing like that every week from now on, then they'll be in with a chance. And they play Castleford this Friday, or this Saturday, I should say. So that that does sort of seem to point to the fact that they might be in recovery mode, and hopefully by they will consolidate their place in the top 6.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously they'll be full of confidence going into next week. And those players, Matt Duffy and Williams, they're the type that, once they get that confidence and get a roll on, they could be a real...
Well, Duffy's a confidence player, isn't he? He does sometimes make some fairly basic errors, but I've always enjoyed watching him. I used to love watching him when he played for St George, and when he left that club, there was a bit of controversy because a lot of St George fans wanted him to stay, but the club decided to let him go, and he came to Warrington. And he actually came in the middle of last season, so he's been here more than a year now. But and he's had some great games for Warrington, but also some dodgy ones. But hopefully his uptick in form will coincide with the playoffs, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. We also had the Giants defeated the Leeds. Was it 21-12? I think I've written.
Yeah, very controversial field goal there, kicked by Jake Connor, where certainly the Leeds contingent didn't think it had gone through the posts, and I'm not even sure that Jake Connor himself thought it did either, if I'm, to judge from their reaction on the field. But, as they always say, just look at the scoreboard, and that tells you whether it went through the posts or not, even if perhaps it didn't, and then they got a late penalty goal as well to make it 21-12. These two teams, Huddersfield and Leeds, are both now, along with Hull, 4 points outside the top 6. I mean, it looks a forlorn hope now, by and large, for either of them to get into the playoffs. But they've still got a mathematical chance, and as long as they've got a mathematical chance, they will no doubt keep pushing to try and get there. I mean, Huddersfield urgently need to win at Leigh this weekend, and Leeds are actually playing at Hull. So, whichever team loses that game will definitely be out of the playoff contention, and the other, the winner might still have a chance of getting there. But we've only got 4 games left now, so all these clubs that are not in the top 6 at the moment are all running out of time.
Absolutely. It's good clashes going forward, that's for sure. And moving on to some news, obviously last week we touched on the television rights deal. Obviously those negotiations are sort of still going forward over the next month or so, but some of the details we have learnt is that there are plans for Sky to broadcast every game next year.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you've found out?
Well, the amount of money Sky are paying, I understand, is £21.5 million per year. It was initially reported at 23, but I think 21.5 is the correct figure. And I also understand that there is going to be 17 games made available potentially for free-to-air broadcasters compared to the 10 games that have been made for free, that have been available for free-to-air this year. That Channel 4 didn't really buy the rights to, or took the rights to. It would be great, as far as I'm concerned, if Channel 4 were to broadcast 17 games next year. I think Channel 4 more or less got the games for nothing in 2022 and 23. Super League will be hoping for, to make some money from Channel 4 or any other bidder for those games for 2024, because apart from anything else, they need to make up the shortfall in the Sky broadcast money. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether Channel 4 do bite again. I think it would be a terrible waste if they didn't, Jake, because they've done it for 2 years now. They've done a very good job on broadcasting rugby league. They've got a new audience that might not normally watch our sport, and it would be a terrible shame to throw that away. So it's going to be a particularly interesting introduction because, of course, they'll be wanting to pay as little as possible. I don't think Channel 4 is a very wealthy broadcaster, but is there an agreement to be made? Well, I certainly hope so.
Absolutely. I know for me, when I moved over, I was surprised that first of all, that only 2, sometimes 3 games were televised in a weekend, and then also that there was none on free to air, or apart from the Channel 4 games every weekend.
Yes,
I know back home usually we have 3 games televised on free to air with Channel 9 and the rest on Fox League, and I think that just having those 3 games is a huge benefit for the exposure of the game.
The great thing about the way that the game is broadcast in Australia is that you know precisely what the slots are, don't you, for the weekly slots. 1 on a Thursday night, 2 on a Friday, 3 on a Saturday, and normally 2 on a Sunday, at clearly defined times. My worry about what we've learned about the Sky deal is, of course, rugby league isn't the major sport in England in the way that it is in New South Wales and Queensland. And Sky have done a massive deal with the English Football League to cover Football League games, and those games will probably, I would imagine, get priority over its rugby league coverage. So what I'm not sure about is when rugby league games will be broadcast and on which of the Sky channels. We need to learn that. But my fear is that Sky will sort of boot us around, just stick us into whatever holes happen to be available, and we'll get a situation where we can never be sure what time rugby league is going to be shown, and that would be an enormous shame. And I would like to think that the people who have negotiated this deal will be able to insist to Sky that, the broadcast times will be X, Y, and Z. And those times will be consistent. I mean, I'll give you another example. We seem now, we've had, for most of this season, we've had Thursday night games on Sky, but now those games seem to have disappeared. Yeah. And they're moving to having Saturday afternoon games. It just seems quite amazing that Sky seemed to shift rugby league around, to suit its own requirements rather than to suit rugby league's requirements.
Yeah. I mean, I love a Thursday night fixture as much as I love a Saturday afternoon fixture. It'd be
Sure.
great if we could get two there permanently.
Of course.
Because I think on a weekend there's nothing better than going to the footy at 3 p.m. with your family and sitting down and having an afternoon and then
Absolutely.
going home and calling it an early night or continuing on.
Sure.
So yeah, there's great potential.
The thing is, what frustrates me though is that it's interesting. We've had quite a few people writing to us in League Express this week saying, games should be on Saturday or Sunday afternoons because that's when most fans find it easiest to get to games. And certainly that's true if you travel on the M62, the motorway that connects Lancashire and Yorkshire. Go on it on a Friday night, Jake, and it's purgatory. Yeah. You're stuck in traffic as often as not. Thursday night is much the same. Yeah. And I've always found it frustrating that the people who run our sport and alongside Sky, they're always scheduling games for evening matches which involve cross-Pennine travel. It wouldn't be so bad. Thursday night games would be fine. I mean, for example, there are 5 teams based in the Manchester region, aren't there? Five teams that are all in that locality. If you actually organise games between those 5 so that the away fans didn't have to travel far, and in particular didn't have to travel on the M62, you get much better crowds.
Absolutely.
You really would. And similarly, on this side of the Pennines in Yorkshire, if you only organise games between Yorkshire sides for a Thursday night, but they don't do that. They often have, say Hull travelling to Warrington or something ridiculous like that, which is guaranteed to cut the crowd size down. There's no planning in anything in our sport, it seems to me. You've got to, the fixture list is such an important element of marketing the game. You've got to put on the right fixtures at the right time. And, if you're going to have cross-Pennine travel, which obviously you do have with many of our games, then put those on a weekend when fans can travel easily and boost the crowd figures in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not as simple as just lining up a couple of teams and drawing some arrows between them. You've got to put some planning into it.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, this also gives us the ability to have a video referee at every game, something that fans have been calling for a while.
Well, some fans have. I mean, not all fans like video referees, and I'm a bit more sceptical as well, if I'm really honest about it. There's nothing annoys me more than seeing a great try, going through lots of pairs of hands, and then the referee sends it to the video referee, who spends 5 minutes trying to find a reason to disallow the try. Yeah. It really cheeses me off, does that? And whereas when video referees first came into the game, I was 100% in favour. I'm now very lukewarm about them, really, and I think this. In rugby league, I don't know how much money we're going to spend on having video refs at every game, but my goodness, I'd rather spend that money on marketing the game than trying to be even more pedantic about whether tries are genuine or not. The old days when you just accepted the referee's decision, I sort of look back on now with a little bit of nostalgia, if I'm really honest about it, Jake.
Yeah, definitely. And we've seen our own dramas back home in the NRL with the bunker. There's been nothing more controversial.
Yeah, no matter what system you've got, some people are going to make mistakes. Yep. Let's just accept it that, there will be mistakes. Obviously, the people on the receiving end of mistakes will be angry about them. But that's all part of the game, and sometimes you might even lose a game because of a referee's bad decision. That's just part of the game, I'm afraid, and I think we ought to just, be big enough to accept it.
One of the things that annoys me is when you're watching and the video ref has said, all right, can we go back to the previous angle? And it's like that communication between the video ref and whoever the video director is. It seems to take another 15 seconds before they go back to the previous angle. So, yeah, it can be quite frustrating at times.
Well, if you think back to the Challenge Cup final, that late Hull Kingston Rovers try by Matt Purcell. Yep. I mean, they took ages making a decision on it. In a curious way, that wasn't so bad in one sense, though, because it just added to the drama, didn't it? You could see them going over it and going over it and going over it. The referee on the field had awarded the try but had gone to the video ref. And the tension built up on both sides as none of us knew whether the try was going to be given or not. So in that sense, it sort of... It did add to the drama, I suppose, but in most cases, that's not the case, is it really?
And the ramifications as well that it has on the momentum of the game. You know, you give players a 5-minute break, and one side might have a real momentum sort of roll on, and then I guess you're sitting there for 5 minutes watching a replay. It's going to take some sting out of the game. In other news, Papua New Guinea have named Justin Holbrook as their head coach going forward. This is a bit of a surprise to me, but great for Justin. That
came out of the blue as far as I was concerned. I didn't, it's not something I anticipated. And, I thought Justin was going to go back to the Roosters and spend all his time there. But instead he's also doing this new job with the Cummels. And they do play in the tournament against Fiji and the Cook Islands at the end of this season, and I think most of those games are going to be played in Port Moresby, if I understand it properly. So good luck to Justin. He very nearly came to Warrington, but decided at the last minute that that wasn't to be. I'm a great admirer of his as a coach. I don't think it's too surprising that since he left the Gold Coast in was it June? I think or was it May? I can't remember now, But certainly since he left them, they've sort of fizzled out their season, hasn't it? And I'm not surprised about that, really. Of course, they've got Des Hasler going there next year. But no, Justin was, I thought, a great coach at St Helens. He won the title with them in 2019 and, set in motion that great St Helens side that Christian Wolff then came and built on as well. So, he's a great coach, and I think he'll be really good for PNG.
Yeah, absolutely. We wish him all the best. But speaking of the NRL, this weekend they're heading into their final round of the season. We had team list Tuesday. The team lists were released in the past 24 hours, and there's a lot of teams who have decided to rest their players. The two main ones, I guess, the Brisbane Broncos and the Melbourne Storm have pretty much nearly put forward a reserve grade side heading into this weekend. Obviously, the Brisbane Broncos this weekend could determine whether they get the minor premiership.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you were a head coach in either the Melbourne Storm's position or the Brisbane Broncos, would you be resting your players a week before the finals?
Well, it depends. It just depends. Let's have a look at the league table in the NRL. We've got Melbourne Storm on 36 points. They're almost certain to finish fourth, whether they win or lose this game. So what's in it for them? I think Craig Bellamy's attitude is that he'd rather rest his players than risk some of them being injured for the start of the playoffs. Brisbane are in first place, and if they win, they'll win the Giltinan Shield for the minor premiership. But what's far more important to them is winning the grand final. Having said that, it's quite interesting. Contrast what they're doing with what happened before the Rugby League Challenge Cup final. If you remember, that week before the Cup final, Adrian Lamb played his strongest side in a league game and got the 2 points and actually didn't suffer any injuries. Willie Peters at Hull Kingston Rovers played a lot of reserves and got hammered, but then brought them back for the cup final itself. And Leigh still won the Challenge Cup despite having played a full side the previous week. So I would, if I were a coach, to cut a long story short, I think I would tend to play my strongest side for every game if I possibly could. Although, having said that, it's by no means cut and dried, because you've also got the sort of strategic thought in your mind that you want to give some of your reserve players a chance to show what they can do, because if you do get injuries, you might need them to come into the side. So it's a difficult decision, and I can see it from both sides. And particularly when a place is secure in the top four. The top four in the NRL is, won't be changed now. Nobody can change it. The really interesting part of that of the NRL is, positions 5 to 8, which are by no means as clear.
Yeah, I mean, I've got no issue whether teams want to rest or play their players. I understand Panthers, they're going to list their full-strength side heading into the weekend, so they're obviously trying to play for that number 1 spot. And it just happens to be that the Broncos are facing off against the Storm, so it could be a really good match of the reserves, and I'm really excited to see some of the talent that's coming through from both systems. And I guess also, like, you look at some of the major injuries we saw last weekend, that might have swayed it,
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, Craig Bellamy and Kevy Walters. Obviously, Jerome Luai with that shoulder dislocation, AC joint injury. Fingers crossed he can get back in time, but, geez, you'd have to think playing with that would be very painful for anyone.
You would think so, wouldn't you? You would think so, but players do play with injuries.
That's right.
And who can forget Cooper Cronk playing in the grand final with was it a broken shoulder or something when he played for the Roosters and led them to victory? Yeah. Incredible, really.
Just seeing the X-rays of that, like, you sit there and shake your head, like,
yeah.
Very dangerous. And in other news, we've had a signing over the past 24, 48 hours. Jack Murchie, he has agreed to terms with the Huddersfield Giants, 3-year deal from next season. He's a young back rower out of the Parramatta Eels system. I think his issue with Para is he was stuck behind some really good players and just didn't quite get his shot. He's behind the likes of Sean Lane, Ryan Madison, Bryce Cartwright. So I think this is a really good signing from Huddersfield Giants. Have you seen much of him?
I don't know much about Jack Murchie, if I'm really honest about it. No, I can't say that I do know him. But, I mean, there have been a lot of players from Parramatta. Tom Opacic came to Hull KR this year from them. I'm not sure what made Tom sign for Hull KR, but, maybe it was much of the same thing, that Para have got a very strong squad. But oddly enough, they've not qualified for the playoffs this year. And I would like to draw your attention to one sort of parallel, because it's interesting that in Super League there are 6 Yorkshire clubs, and at the moment those 6 clubs occupy the bottom 6 places in Super League. All the top clubs are either from Lancashire or from France.
Yeah.
In Australia, most of the Sydney clubs are not in the top 8, are they? There are very, very few of them. It's interesting. It's one of those years where the majority of clubs that are going to make the playoffs are from outside Sydney. There are 1 or 2 Sydney clubs. I mean, if you count Penrith as a Sydney club, I know Penrith is probably quite separate from Sydney, but most people count it as a Sydney club. Cronulla are in there, but are not certain to remain in the top 8 after this weekend's results. They play Canberra, and if they lose to Canberra, they might conceivably drop out. Then you've got South Sydney and Sydney Roosters with a massive game this Friday night to see which of those 2 will make the top 8. They both won't do it, so enormous. But you've got the bottom clubs, West Tigers, St George, and Canterbury. Then you've got Manly and Parramatta, also not in the top 8 and can't make the top 8. So it's a strange, bit of a parallel, really, that it's not been a great year for the Sydney clubs, and it's not been a great year for the Yorkshire clubs.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And, it's going to be an exciting weekend to see how that
fabulous.
Bottom, 6, 5 through to 8, finishes at the end of this.
Well, there are 10 clubs still in with a chance of getting in the top 8. So there are 6 clubs battling for those 4 places. Newcastle, even if Newcastle lose this weekend at St George, they will still be in the top 8, but they can't get higher than 5th. And but again, I'll just point out again something that I've mentioned before in a previous issue of this podcast, Jake, but which I think is worth saying again. The 3 clubs that are currently in the top 8 that weren't at the end of last season. Brisbane gone from 9th to 1st. The New Zealand Warriors gone from 15th to 3rd. And Newcastle Knights gone from 14th to 5th. They've all got English assistant coaches. So,
secret recipe.
If you want success, get an English assistant coach. Is my advice to any of these clubs that are sitting outside the top 8 at the moment.
Have you had a chance to throw that idea to Darryl Powell?
Well, funnily enough, Darryl went on holiday after losing his job at Warrington. I think he's almost certainly back by now, of course. Yeah. But I did actually text him and did mention that to him. So, and since then, actually, the positions of those 3 clubs have improved even more. They really have. So, if I were him, I'd certainly be looking at that at one of the clubs, certainly in the bottom part of the table, and who knows? I mean, I'm sure Darryl's coaching career has a long way to go. Whether he carries on in this country or somewhere else, but you never know.
Absolutely, a lot of great coaching minds to work alongside and learn from as well over there. So,
absolutely, yes.
That's great. Any other news this week that you'd like to get into, Martin?
Well, one of the things that was very noticeable in Australia was the controversy over Latrell Mitchell, wasn't it? It's a sad controversy, really, because Rodney Churchill, who is the son of the great Clive Churchill, at every NRL Grand Final, they present the Clive Churchill Medal to the player of the match. It's the equivalent of the Lance Todd Trophy, I suppose, that we have in this country. And because obviously Clive Churchill died many years ago, his wife Joyce used to present it until very recently, but she's obviously now sadly very old and I believe is not very well. So Rodney Churchill took over the responsibility of presenting the medal at the grand final. But last week he actually texted Nick Pappas, the chairman of South Sydney, and said that, and made some incredibly disparaging remarks about Latrell Mitchell, basically, obviously criticising Latrell's form for South Sydney, but also saying that, Latrell seemed to be more interested in, in Indigenous political battles rather than the club itself, which I thought was incredibly misjudged on his part. And as I say, I think he described Latrell as a cancer at the club or something like that, which is just absolutely, you just shouldn't say that. Even if you're an ordinary fan, you shouldn't say that. But when you're an influential figure within the game, as Rod obviously is, it was incredibly badly judged. And he's now, what was not clear was how what was apparently a private message from him to Nick Pappas got into the public domain. Both Nick Pappas and Rod Churchill denied putting it out there, which suggests that if they're both being honest about that, which I assume they are, then somebody else must have somehow got hold of it and put it into the media. But it was a very sad thing, and Rod Churchill has now issued quite a full apology for having said all that, and has more or less asked for forgiveness from Latrell and from the club itself. And I think he's said he's going to stand down from actually presenting the Churchill medal at the grand final. So I think that's he's acted quite quickly to try and put right that wrong, which you've got to admire him for doing that, even if you disagree with what he originally said, and hopefully that will die down. Oddly enough, Latrell will actually miss this Friday night's game against Sydney Roosters because of a suspension. And Latrell has, if if Rod Churchill had been a lot more moderate in what he said about Latrell, if he'd just criticised his form for South Sydney this year, I think he'd have had a lot more support for what he said, because Latrell is an absolutely fabulous player, and but I don't think he's probably played at his best for quite a lot of the time this year for one reason or another. He's just not been as dominant as he's got the potential to be, and that's if Rod had simply said that, I think that would have been perfectly probably correct, to be honest, and most people would have sympathised with him.
Yeah, that's right. And like you said, there's a right way and a wrong way to go about criticising someone's performance, and he's obviously taken that completely wrong approach. But the other question is, like, is he damaging Clive Churchill's reputation and legacy? I don't think so, because people respect Clive for his accomplishments in the game, but it's not a good look, and I'm sure Clive wouldn't appreciate his son.
Although Clive Churchill was a very direct guy. Nobody, obviously Clive is no longer with us. He was a brilliant player. But nobody can speak for him. We can't really say what he would have said about this. I'll just tell you one story about Clive, though, that's quite a good one. Back in 1958, when Great Britain were touring Australia, you remember there was the famous Test match in Brisbane, where the English captain Alan Prescott broke his arm, but carried on playing because Great Britain had a lot of injuries. We were down to 11 men, apparently. And the Australian team said, we'll try not to sort of damage Prescott's arm any more than it's damaged already. And Clive Churchill, who I think wasn't playing in that game, said, "What the hell were they doing? If I'd been playing, I'd have targeted it." Yeah. And as I say, Clive was an old-fashioned, very direct, very outspoken player, and in those days, back in the 1950s, it was a different world, wasn't it?
Yeah,
right. It really was a different world, and the modern era, when we're very anxious not to say anything that upsets people, and quite rightly, I think, as I've said, I think it was wrong. What Rod Churchill said was wrong, but we can't guarantee that Clive wouldn't have said the same thing.
Yeah, I guess if Clive had said it, though, you'd go, all right, there's a little bit of merit behind it just because of his resume. But yeah, as we said, a right way and a wrong way to go about it. And it's a bit disappointing, I think, too, because I think with Latrell, he's an emotional player. He's not afraid to get up and celebrate after a try, and he brings a. And
he's not afraid to celebrate Indigenous culture, is he? That's the point.
Yeah, that's right.
He's very, very much understands his own position in society, I think.
Absolutely, and you and I have spoken about this away from the podcast, but there's a real demand or a need for players with big personalities to come into our game. And,
absolutely.
There's always discussion around we need to get those personalities back out and on display, but as soon as someone like Latrell shows their personality, he's harshly scrutinised by the media.
Well, I think, and I think what Latrell does in terms of Indigenous people is a great thing and should be admired by everyone. He's very proud of his heritage, and it's undeniable that for many years Indigenous people were treated very badly in Australia. They didn't even have the right to vote until I think the early 70s, if I'm right. And there have been some great Indigenous players in rugby league of all the sports in Australia that have given opportunities to Indigenous people. I think rugby league is the greatest and the proudest. So, we listen to the Indigenous voice in rugby league very, very carefully, and I think Latrell plays a role in that process, and that should be respected.
absolutely. And some of the greatest players we've ever had have been of Indigenous descent or Indigenous players. Obviously, Jonathan Thurston, Artie Beetson.
Yeah, the great Artie Beetson.
That's right. So, it's a long list of Indigenous players that have achieved great things in our game. Looking forward to this weekend, is there any games that are really catching your eye that you're excited to watch?
Well, most of them look pretty good to me. And quite a few of them are hard to predict. I mean, my team originally was, of course, Wakefield Trinity. I'm now strictly neutral, but it's hard not to look at that game on Sunday between Wakefield and St Helens.
Yep.
It's a massive tall order for Wakefield to win that game, but win it they must if they're going to avoid relegation. And the funny thing is, some of the best results in Wakefield's history have come against St Helens. There's a long history of Wakefield shocking St Helens. Dating right back to the first round of the Challenge Cup in 1960, when St Helens were top of the table and Wakefield went there and won 15-10 with two players badly injured. One of the shock results of all time, and Wakefield beat St Helens in the Championship final replay in 1967, a game at Swinton that I remember going to as a kid, and they beat them in the 1979 Challenge Cup semi-final at Headingley with a last minute try by Andy Fletcher, the great Wakefield winger of the day. So they also inflicted in 1999 St Helens' first defeat that season when Saints were coached by the great Ellery Hanley. Yeah. So, it's by no means unknown for Wakefield to beat St Helens, but it would be a massive surprise if they did it this week. Yeah. But, Wakefield fans will all be, keeping their fingers crossed and hoping that it can happen, of course.
Yep. Well, you heard it here first. Wakefield for the upset. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think St Helens fans will. If any St Helens fans are watching us, they'll have a bit of a wry smile. It's probably a bit of a fantasy to think that Wakefield can beat them, really. But you never know. And Wakefield have had a good record recently at Bellevue before they crashed to Castleford. So, obviously shocks are part of sport, aren't they? And it would be interesting if another one did happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we've got our viewers and listeners, don't forget, you've got the new edition of the Rugby League World September issue.
Absolutely.
You can order that online at the www.totalrl.com/shop.
Yes.
Grab yourself a subscription of the League Express weekly newspaper while you're there.
Absolutely, there we are.
And while you're there, also a copy of Richard's new book.
50 legends of 50 Wigan legends, isn't it?
In their own words.
In their own words, that's right. Yes.
So, a few things there to go and check out. We might get into the magazine a bit in next week's episode just to talk about some of the things you might find in there.
Yeah.
We're a bit short on time today. Also, while we've got you, if you'd like to, go and subscribe to the Total Rugby League YouTube channel if you're interested in watching Martin and I sit here and discuss the news every week. And, or you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on Google Podcasts now as well, which is also a
marvellous,
great way to access us if you're at work and want to tune in. But yeah, I'm happy with that, Martin. We might leave it there and come back again next week.
Pleasure, Jake, and good to see you again. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Cheers. Bye.